You're listening to Art Affairs, episode 49. Today I'll be talking to Caitlin Hackett. Alright, so my name is Michael Faith, and this is Art Affairs. Art Affairs is my attempt at shining a spotlight on the many wonderful people that make up this amazing art community, featuring conversations with artists, gallerists, curators, telling their stories. You can dig through previous episodes, complete with show notes, at artaffairdspodcast.com, but the best way to stay plugged in is to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're really enjoying the show and want to help support what I'm doing here in an even bigger way, check out the Art Affairs Patreon. Not only does it give you an opportunity to help keep the show going, but there are several community-oriented benefits as well, like getting early access to episodes and suggesting questions for upcoming guests. You can find all the information about that at patreon.com/artaffairs. You can also connect with the show on Instagram and Facebook at Art Affairs Podcast. All right, so today's guest is artist Caitlin Hackett. Caitlin has described her work as contemporary mythology, which I think captures her style very well. In our conversation, we talk about her love of magic and mythology, her childhood growing up surrounded by nature in the woods of Northern California, her desire to highlight humanity's impact on nature and the environment, and a whole lot more. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Caitlin Hackett. Caitlin, welcome to the show. It's really good to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about art.
All right, awesome. But first, let's talk about your background a little. And from what I read, you grew up in Northern California near the coast. So what was that area like where you were growing up?
It was really magical. I still get very nostalgic for my childhood there. It's this place that feels sort of otherworldly, really small hippie town, but also a college town. So there were a lot of artists who lived there and musicians, and you could walk down to the plaza and there'd be people juggling and riding unicycles, artists, carrying big canvases. It already was sort of a good setup to make a kid interested in art. But I think the biggest influence for me growing up there was just that it was so deeply embedded in nature. We were surrounded by the redwood forest. There was the ocean to one side, the mountains on the backside. And we would just spend all of our time, playing in the forest, our house backed up to it. So my twin sister and I would be out there just, galloping around through the trees and going to the beach, making up crazy games. It was great. I don't think I'd be doing the kind of art that I'm doing now if I hadn't grown up there.
What kind of work did your parents do?
My dad is an economist, and he was an economics professor at Humboldt State there. And he specialized he taught a lot of just like basic 101 classes, but his real passion has always been green energy and sort of following the like market research for making viable, wind energy, wave energy. He still consults on projects like that, even though he's retired from teaching.
Okay. So in addition to being surrounded by nature, your family already had sort of a vested interest in environmental concerns and stuff like that.
Yeah, 100%. My dad was the one who would take us out backpacking and camping. And if we found, I have a very distinct memory early on, before we even lived in California, when we were in Indiana, of finding a dead crow on one of our hikes. And my dad sort of showing us how to bury it at the root of a pine tree and telling us about how that would nourish the pine tree and sort of the circle of life. So I definitely got a lot of that from him.
Nice. Did you have much exposure to the arts growing up, other than kind of what you saw around campus?
Not a ton. My parents are both really creative people, but they're not artistic. My mom and dad love to tell us stories and read to us, but like neither of them were really taking us out to, galleries or museums that much. When we were really young, we were pretty poor. So most of our trips were camping trips or, trips out to the river. But I think just the fact that they moved us to Arcata was probably the move that inspired both my sister and I to become artists, because that town itself was just so artistic. And my parents put us in an elementary school that was a Sunset School of the Arts. So it was an arts themed elementary school. And that definitely helped. In 5th grade when we were learning geometry, our teacher had us build big geometric costumes and put on a geometry play. Like everything was angled towards creativity, which was great for Allie and I, because we were the kind of kids who learned best that way. And also, if I wasn't like doodling on something, I essentially wasn't paying any attention. So it was good to be in a school where that was sort of at least supported in some way, and not absolutely nailed out of me. So
what kind of things sparked your creativity at that age? Like what did you get excited about artistically?
Mostly creatures, which is sort of the same now as it was then. My sister and I would spend hours drawing together, making up stories about different magical animals and the worlds they lived in, the environments they lived in, the houses, the friends they had. And, we would try to test each other by listing as many animals as we could to combine. So we'd be like, oh, it has to be, a hippo, rat, bat, horse. And you'd see if you could make that viable. And yeah, so that's what I loved as a kid. I didn't do a lot of people or humans or anything. It was all animals. My little elementary school best friend and I, we wrote a little collaborative story together where we were magical flying Siamese cats who could see ghosts, as you're wont to do when you're in 2nd grade. But we illustrated the whole thing too, and it's my parents saved that, and I recently got to see my little childhood renditions of the magical cat detectives. So
that's awesome. So like growing up, like throughout junior high school, did you always know that you wanted to be an artist, or did you have aspirations for other things?
I actually thought I was going to go into wildlife biology. I followed a pretty strong like scientific academic course through high school, because I really thought I was going to end up going into one of the UCs to study wildlife biology or do something like biotech. That was sort of my interest when I was younger. And people would always tell me, "Oh, you'll be an artist. I can't wait to see like your art career." And I would always be like, "No. Like I'm going to be a scientist. Like I'll be studying animals. I'll be out on some expedition, finding rare endangered species or studying strange, molds." Like that was my whole interest when I was in high school.
Nice.
But I was always drawing. I would, keep my sketchbook with me all the time. And I think my parents kind of picked up on that. And so they actually wound up having me do a pre-college program for the arts down in LA at CalArts. And so after that program, that's when I was like, oh, I guess I could go to art school. And so when I was applying to colleges, I applied to both the, sort of California UC system for science, and then I applied to sort of a smattering of art schools. Nice. And I just figured I'd see what happened. So, yeah.
That's awesome. So obviously, throughout your whole upbringing, from even the point of elementary school, your parents seem very supportive of your interest in the arts.
Yeah, I am extremely fortunate. I'm really privileged to have a family that's always been very supportive of what I wanted to do creatively. And I think who even paid more attention than I necessarily did when I was younger. I think it's because neither of them had that chance when they were growing up. They both sort of had to just pick the careers that they had to do. They had kids young and families that just didn't have the financial resources to support them. And so when they saw that my sister and I were both sort of creatively bent, I think they just decided to let that flourish, which I feel really fortunate that they did so, because that is not typically the case, or at least not often the case.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you ended up going to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, which is the same as Travis Louis, who had on before.
Yeah.
I talked to him a little bit about Pratt. What brought you to Pratt? Like, is that one of the top schools that you I guess applied for?
When I applied, it was because I had met a guy in my pre-college program who was really keen on Pratt. I'd actually never heard of it. I hadn't even really considered applying to East Coast schools until I was in that pre-college program. And then obviously everyone there was talking about RISD and Pratt and all these, schools on the East Coast. So I just figured I'd apply. And I actually wound up touring Pratt and was sort of horrified. I'm from like this little town, in Northern California. New York just felt really ominous to me, like very daunting. But when I got in, I got a really good scholarship, and I just figured life is short. I'm just going to go for it. Everyone else I know from college or from high school is going to college in, San Diego or Santa Cruz or going out to Chico. And it was sort of a spur of the moment. Like, let's just see what happens if I go 3,000 miles away and take a risk, sort of jump off the end of the diving board and see what happens. Yeah.
I mean, it's about as far away as you can get from home. I mean, the exact opposite.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. My parents were laughing. They're like, what did we do to drive you away?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And also just the context difference. I mean, being completely surrounded by nature to be kind of thrust in the largest city in the country.
Oh, yeah. The first 2 weeks I was there, I was like, oh, I've made a critical mistake. Like, this is not for me. This is bad. I was also like just a real good kid in high school, didn't drink, didn't party, didn't, just had my little circle of like really great, really nerdy friends. And, art school is pretty wild. And I definitely remember feeling like I was totally out of my depth. And, I got so lost on the subway. This is obviously like before cell phones. So I would just get on the train and end up who even knows where. I'd be like, well, I don't know. I thought I was going to Manhattan and now I'm in Queens. But, then I started to make friends and I got kind of into it. And once, I was in the classes, I was like, okay, like I could make this work. And New York is a city that for me, like grew on me slowly. Like at first I really missed, the trees and the greenery and the ocean. But the longer I was there, it's got sort of a pulse of its own. It's a very like hypnotic magic that New York has, where you feel as though anything could happen at any moment. And that is really addictive in a special way, especially for, a young like 18-year-old trying to go into the arts. Like everything is happening there. Everything you could dream of, good or bad, you could see it all and probably experience it all. So
do you think you'd ever want to live there again?
No.
Like, are there aspects of it that you miss?
I definitely miss it, especially around this time of year. I loved autumn in New York. And I do miss like the art scene out there. Since moving to California, I'm a lot more of like a homebody. I have galleries I work with here in the Bay, but I just don't go out to the openings as much. There was something about being in New York where you would just go, like you'd go to everything. So I miss that. We would just wander around Chelsea and go to the gallery openings and sip those little teeny, 2-inch cups of wine that they give you. And just see art, like any kind of art, good or bad. And there'd be people doing strange performances. There'd be people building sculptures out of yarn. Like you just never knew what you were going to see. And I do miss like the Brooklyn Museum and the Met. Like you could, as a New York resident, pay what you wanted. So you'd pay $1 and just go spend a whole day at the Met.
And I know that while you were at Pratt, there was an especially influential show at the Brooklyn Museum while you were there. I think a Walton Ford show. So I guess how did that show impact you, and what kind of influence did that have on you?
That show, I think, probably pushed me in the direction that wound up being the style of work I'm still doing to this day. Before that, I think there's something about being at a really traditional art school that makes you think that you need to create a certain kind of art. So I very much had sort of fallen into this mindset that some of my professors had, that if you were making, capital A art, it had to be oil paintings of, beautiful nude figures or historical scenes or still lives. And that was great practice, but it never really sparked anything in me. So it had started to feel a little bit rote. I mean, the challenge was interesting to try and capture those scenes. And I'm really glad I did that training, but none of it actually really spoke to me. But I just didn't think that doing big monsters was something that you could do as, a fine artist. I thought that was something I kind of had to leave behind until I saw Walton Ford's show. And here he was painting these enormous, gorgeous, just huge pieces, whole walls of strange animals and these sort of parables that they were playing out. I just couldn't believe that was something that you could do as a fine artist. And That was a game changer for me. That sort of changed the way that I thought about the kind of work that I could be making and what it actually meant to be a working artist. So
that's awesome.
That if I hadn't seen that show, I don't know that I'd be doing what I'm doing, because I really was sort of locked into this more traditional mindset, I think.
No, it's amazing that had that sort of impact on you, and that these sort of just I guess coincidental events in our lives completely changed the direction of the rest of it, Oh,
I know. It's kind of wild to me to think that if I just hadn't, because it was a professor who had us go, it was this incredible drawing professor I had, Nanette Carter. She's a working artist in New York, and she was one of my just absolute favorite professors. Really incredibly talented, but also the kind of person who teaches you how to be fanatical about a line and to obsess over paper and all those little sort of joys that come with working in traditional mediums. Like she could go on sort of rhapsodies about line quality and line weight and graphite. But she's the one who took our class to see that Walton Ford show. And it's only through sort of the chance fate that I signed up for her drawing class and not one of the, half dozen other professors who are all equally talented, but I just happened to like the time slot of her class because it was in the afternoon and I am not a morning person. But yeah, it's so serendipitous, and it's, I often wonder what would my career have shaped out to be if I had taken just a slightly different set of courses. Because so many of the people who I went to school with wound up doing really radically different things, even though most of us were technically the same major.
That's amazing. So, I guess your time at Pratt, you graduated in 2009. Do you feel that your time there was, it sounds like it was a rewarding one, and you probably wouldn't or may not be where you are today without it. Is that still your opinion of just art school in general?
It was for me. It's definitely not for everyone. I loved it. I had a great time. I don't think I'd be making the art I'm making without it, but I also don't think that people should go if they're going to end up in $80,000 of debt. For as many of my sort of studio companions from Pratt who loved it, I had just as many who, left their sophomore year or dropped out their junior year because it just wasn't for them. And I get a lot of people who will email me to ask, should I go to an art school? Because I have talked about how much Pratt helped me and how being in New York in that time was so critical to the art that I'm making. But I'm extremely privileged. I have full family support. I did not have to go into debt to go to art school. And because of that, it's made my career possible. I don't know that my career would be possible with student debt the way that a lot of my compatriots sort of left Pratt with. Even he's now my ex-husband, but we're still good friends. And he was a photo major at Pratt. And he dropped out our sophomore year and just wound up going to work for a fashion photographer in New York City because he just didn't like the photo program at Pratt and it wasn't really speaking to him creatively. So he just left, and, living in New York, you can go find an artist to work with. So he just found a photographer and wound up, sort of pursuing his own path.
Nice. Well, and the student debt situation has gotten even more terrible now.
Oh, it's a nightmare. Yeah. I just don't, especially when you're trying to be creative, to have that sort of financial weight, which as an artist, you always have that on your shoulders, but to then also be paying off just absolutely monumental loads of student debt. I don't know how you could even really operate creatively. And people do it all the time, but it's such a stressor.
Yeah. So you ended up sticking around New York even after you graduated, for at least a few years. Had that just sort of become home for you at that point? You were just comfortable there?
Yeah. I loved it. There's nothing like being in your 20s in New York City. I graduated in the middle of the '09 recession. So, and moving across the country is expensive. So I was just I'm just going to hunker down. I got a waitressing job. I had made some friends who were curators. So I was doing, just a smattering of group shows where I'd make one piece every 6 months. I was barely painting that first year out of Pratt because I was working 55 hours a week at the restaurant.
Oh, wow.
And having a good time. I met some of my closest friends, working in the trenches at the restaurant. But it was a weird time in New York because we got plunged really abruptly into that recession right when we graduated. Everyone I knew either had to stay and just kind of scramble trying to, get by in New York. And most of the people I knew from my studio programs just left the city altogether because it was just too expensive to stay. But I loved it. So, I was still really deep in that kind of like hypnotic magic of New York, and that, I don't know, that energy that it has where you just, you feel as though you're walking through some other world, So yeah, I would waitress all day, and then I'd go home, and if I could muster the energy, I would try to draw something.
That's crazy. So like during that first year, obviously you didn't have a whole lot of time. How did that ease up to where you were able to make some more time for your art?
Over the course of essentially 4 years, like I worked at the restaurant. I essentially got another college degree in waitressing.
Okay.
So I did a 4-year stint at the restaurant. And I started out just working, that first year, I was there every single day. But I was able to still do a few drawings. And because I'd made some connections with curators, I had people who were interested in the work I was doing. And that kind of pushed me to be like, okay, I need to carve out some time to still be making art, because I have people who are interested in having me in shows, and everything I was putting into the shows at that point was work I had done in school. So I just kind of forced myself, like on my lunch breaks at the restaurant, because it was one of those restaurants that braked between lunch and dinner service. I would bring my work with me and work on like little tiny commissions and just little illustrations, little pieces for shows. And as the years went on, I just cut my hours gradually because I was able to start making some money on the side from the art I was doing. Not a ton, but enough that like really slowly I weaned myself off of the restaurant. And so by the last year that I was working there, I was only working there maybe like 15 hours a week and then doing art on the side. Although really it had become like restaurant on the side and mostly doing art. I had found a job with a gaming company doing creature concept design work, one of the few who were still hiring traditional artists at that point to do their sketches. And that essentially, paid for me to not have to waitress. And it took a long time, though. Whenever I think back on that, it's like, those were the years I produced like the least amount of art, just because I was working so much at the restaurant. And by the time you'd get home, you'd be so wiped out that you just weren't making that much.
So how long did you work for the creature design?
Oh, I still occasionally work for them. Yeah. But now it's really sporadic, but once a year they'll still reach out for a design, which is fun for me. It's something I'd love to do.
That's awesome. So how does that work? Like the process between getting your traditional art into the video games, like what is that whole process like?
So I'll start out, they'll send me sort of the idea they have for the monster, which is usually the kind of terrain it lives in, and then the sort of effect it has on people around it, which I specialize in pretty like gruesome creatures. That's my favorite, gaping mouths lined with little hands to pull victims in, stuff like that. It's really fun. And because I've worked with them for years, I kind of know their vibe. And they want a game that has creatures that have like a little bit of a traditional feel, sort of that watercolor feeling. But yeah, so they'll give me an idea, we want like some swampy deity that is, vaguely reminiscent of a giant toad or something. And they'll be like, great, I'll create a couple of sketches for them, usually 5. And I'll do 5 really loose graphite concept sketches where I'll just like throw different ideas around, see what I want it to look like. Is it going to have like weird long human legs, or is it going to have this huge like mouth lined with little baby hands? Like whatever it is, I'll like throw some weird ideas out there. And then they'll get back to me and tell me what aspects of each sketch they liked and didn't like. And so after that, I'll just proceed with like refining it over and over, taking the ideas they liked and putting them into a piece. And once they need to put it in the game, I then sketch, there's a technical name for this I can't think of, but I essentially just do every angle. So I'll do like both sides, a top, a front, and a back for them, just in rough sketches, and then one finished like watercolor painting that they then take, and they have artists who render those in what, I actually don't even know any of the programs. I need to learn them, but essentially like Maya or whatever like 3D rendering program they're using. And they also make games out of them, like tabletop games. So they also will take those sketches and turn them into a little 3D printed creature icon,
wow.
which is really cool.
That's awesome.
So I've gotten to see a few of those that they've made.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So how did you ultimately get from New York back to California? What prompted that move?
About 7.5 years ago, I guess 8 years ago now, I just was really missing the West Coast. I missed the trees, and New York had started to really wear on me, just with like the really long gray winters and that darkness, and living in these tiny apartments that essentially faced into walls. Like you could reach your hand out and, touch the brick wall of the building next door. Like you just never see sunlight. And so my sister had recently moved from San Diego to Oakland, and Oakland appealed to me a lot more than San Diego did as a destination, because Oakland is reminiscent of Brooklyn, and I loved Brooklyn. So that kind of prompted it. It happened really fast after I decided. I had to convince my then boyfriend to go because he loved the East Coast, but I was just like, oh, we'll just like see what happens. And I just kind of planned it all. I quit my restaurant job. I saved up enough money where I was like, I could have enough to pay the bills for 6 months and see if I could make a living just doing art in California. And if that didn't work out, I figured I'd, go back to a restaurant job and figure something else out. But, that was 8 years ago and I'm still doing it.
So no temptation to go back like north to a more rural setting? You like the city vibe enough to kind of stick with it?
I don't know right now. I'm still deciding. I love Oakland so much because I like having access to everything, music and food and theater and art, the, gallery openings and the different sort of events that happen in the city. But it's also really, really expensive. Like it means that I have to scramble constantly. I'm always taking on commissions and new projects and trying to think about what my next, print I'm going to put out is in a way that is not super conducive to creativity. So it's definitely tempting to move back to the forest and, just be back in my trees and maybe live somewhere where the cost of living wasn't quite so high. I mean, my hometown honestly has also become pretty pricey because all of California is pretty pricey, but it's still not, Bay Area prices. So, but yeah, I definitely consider it. It's hard because I love, I just love this city. It's got such a good vibe.
So let's talk about your work a little bit more. And obviously you're sort of bridging this gap between nature and fantasy or mythology. And I think the inspiration for nature makes a lot of sense just from what we talked about growing up surrounded by it. But what about mythology and fantasy? How did those become big focuses for you?
Those are definitely something also from my childhood. My sort of favorite books growing up were all books about Celtic mythology and these like old fairy tale books that my parents had given us and that, my grandparents would read to us. And I really longed for magic when I was young. It's one of those things that I remember really starkly as I got older. Just this feeling of sort of profound loss when I realized that I was never going to find the portal to another world or the wardrobe to get to Narnia or, yeah. Any of that. Like I just remember such a profound sadness. I can still sort of feel it to this day. And it's kind of silly because it's like, well, of course we live in a world without magic. Like those are beautiful stories and allegories, but that's not the world we actually live in. But I had such a profound connection to this idea of worlds that had magic and magical creatures that it was really heartbreaking as, I left sort of my childhood behind to realize, oh, that does not exist. And I became, I think, a little determined to just make it exist. So I figured I'll just create as much magic as I can within my life. And that means inventing magical creatures, drawing these beasts that I sort of imagine occupying the same world. So every painting that I make, I imagine that all these creatures sort of dwell in the same place. And it's just a little bit of an attempt to pull some magic in. Even now, I'm 34 years old and I still have this sense, this sort of pining for a world that has magic in it. And I think creating art is a form of magic that I can sort of still mix my fingers into and do something about.
Yeah, and I've seen you describe your work as surreal realism, as sort of just wanting to make the surreal or depict the surreal or the fantasy in a very real way, because from what you just said, it's because you want those things to be real,
Yeah, it definitely ties into that longing pretty directly.
So do these all, you said these all participate in the same world. Is there sort of a large narrative that you've created around them? Or is it just that you want them to all exist in the same plane of existence?
There's not necessarily an overarching narrative, but there is sort of a lexicon of symbols that I use repeatedly, and those I will reuse again and again. And those sort of tie the creatures together. So I use eyes to represent sort of true sight or wisdom. I do a lot of third eyes, or even creatures with, up to like 8 eyes sort of merged in to their faces or into their bodies. And that's a symbol that I've used over and over and over in my work. And that sort of ties a lot of the creatures together. And then I do a lot of animals with human hands, which has sort of a dual meaning for me. In part, it's this reminder that humans are animals too, the sort of connection between humanity and sort of this bestial form that I think we draw a lot of lines between, but ultimately all of these bodies are animal bodies. And so I'll often put hands onto the creatures that I draw. It's actually part of what got me that job with the gaming company, because they love doing creepy hands on their monsters. And I also love putting hands on monsters and on animals. And that's a symbol that I'll use repeatedly. The other meaning of it for me is hands are a symbol of generosity, but also of greed. And so I can use them, hands can give, but hands can take. So depending on the creature I'm drawing, it can become sort of this allegory for generosity or for greed.
Mm. And you also, like last year you had your Lesser Saints show, which made you use symbols in a very kind of direct way, creating, sort of a way of grouping them into thematic categories using those symbols. Do you think a lot about that when you're creating a body of work, as far as like what types of symbols you want to represent the different, segments of your show?
Yeah, I think a lot about the imagery that I use, a lot about the different creatures and the flowers and all of the objects in it tend to have some kind of meaning, which might be a holdover from my, days at Pratt and sort of that fine art mentality where we did so many art history classes looking at the language that they created, this sort of visual language where everything in those paintings meant something. The flowers, the lay of the fabric, if there was a cat in the piece, a lion, a lamb, a dog, everything had meaning. And so I still like to pull a little bit of that into my own work. And that means a lot to me. So when I make a piece, most of the things in it have some meaning that I've thought about. The flowers will either represent loss or joy or love or hate. That, I'll use animals that maybe traditionally have one meaning in our culture, but you can invert that because animals are often used as symbols, but they're used differently across cultures, and I find that really fascinating. So, I definitely think a lot about the way the creatures and the plants that I use, sort of what they symbolically represent.
Yeah, I was reading about that. I think it was an interview you did in advance of the Lesser Saints show, just about how our treatment of animals will largely depend on our cultural norms, or we'll like idolize horses or treat them in high regard, but then we eat cows, while at the same time other cultures will like idolize or hold cows in high regard. So I guess I found that super interesting, and how you kind of wove that into the show. Is that something that you kind of put a lot of research, or researching some of the other cultures of the world and how they treat animals?
Yeah, especially for that show, I was looking into it a lot, but it's something that's been on my mind for years. I think ever since I was a kid, even when I used to just get so heartbroken if I'd see, other kids in school, like throwing rocks at a squirrel or something. And I was a very soft-hearted kid and probably a soft-hearted adult, but it's something that's occupied my mind for a long time is how much of the way we behave in this world is dependent on the symbols and what those symbols mean to us. But all of it is culturally built. It's all, this is a web that we've built up over generations within cultures. And it's interesting to think that if we'd grown up somewhere different, our ideas would be fundamentally different. There are cultures in which eating dogs is completely normal. I personally find that devastating, but I also don't eat any meat. So I have sort of extended that to other creatures as well. And I don't know, there's something important to me about the way if we could somehow break down these ideas around animals and around the idea of like how we use nature, I think it would make a big difference in creating a more, ecologically stable planet. And that's something I worry a lot about ever since, thinking I'd go into wildlife biology. I've always thought about how fleeting and how fragile the world is and all these species that we're losing. And so much of it is because no one even thinks about, certain like insects or frogs, just these sort of lesser known species that live in the undergrowth. Or even the fact that if you were to sort of raise up like a pig as a pet, like they're just as smart as dogs. So I think a lot about that. We live in a culture that tends to devour. Like what we do is we use and we devour, and we have decided to segment different species into what is acceptable to be devoured and what is acceptable to personify. And yeah, we personify dogs, we personify cats, we personify horses, and we devour the rest.
Mm. And use them for our labor, effectively.
Yeah. And we do it to people too, of course. So it's all linked together, I think.
Well, and I think it was even, well before this last show that I was reading up on something you had said about how the further humans get away from something, whether it's an animal or another person or another, race of people, they become another. It's like the greater that distance is, the less likely we are to foster a strong relationship, Yeah.
Our ability to share sort of an empathetic connection fades and becomes strained the further we get away from it. I've been thinking a lot about it lately because I have a show coming up with Brian Surway next year. And I've been thinking about the work I want to make for it and thinking about this sensation of being disembodied, where it's this sort of disconnect from the physical world and this disconnection from our physical bodies and this inability to relate to creatures that live, fully within their bodies the way that animals do, or fully within the present moment the way that animals do. And sort of creating this world of ghosts where, here's the place where the wetlands once were, here's the place where the forests once were. Like we live in a world more full of ghosts than anything else. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, even though years have gone by, I think, since I first wrote that statement. But it's definitely what still haunts all of the work that I make.
And so your love of nature and obviously your concern for, environmental damage that we're doing to it clearly has been a motivating factor for you. I guess, how do you see art playing into helping with that? Do you think art can help make a change in these kind of large, amorphous global problems?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I think I used to believe very fundamentally yes, because art is a way of communicating, and I used to really believe like if you could just communicate properly with people, you could make them see the world differently, and art is a good way to do that because it can break, it can go past certain language barriers, and because we live in a world where sort of cultural symbols are so deeply ingrained in us. And so define the way that we view animals and view others. Art is a way to change those symbols. It's a way of creating a new visual language, something that you could sort of replace in people's minds the existing narrative that they have, and maybe make them see creatures in a different way. I don't know anymore. I'm definitely at a slightly more cynical arc in my life, just with everything that's been happening over the last few years. But I think it helps. I think that every form of expression helps. I don't think that there's necessarily one piece of art you are going to make that's going to fundamentally change the world. But I do think that creating meaningful work does alter the world that we live in. And it certainly alters the world for the person creating it. I couldn't stop even if I thought it wasn't doing anything, or even if I thought no one was ever going to see it, because I just feel drawn to the page to make things. And I don't know if putting them out in the world is doing that much, but I do like to think that there is just something about creative expression itself that at least puts some facet of myself at ease, and maybe puts others at ease who see it. So I'm just going to keep on trying.
And what are you hoping that people will take away from your work?
I would really like people to see the narrative there as one of fundamentally empathy. I often draw creatures that are sort of in these poses of agony, or whose bodies are sort of coming apart at the edges with these exposed rib cages or exposed bones, or sort of the juxtaposition of a living creature with various sort of organic forms that are overtaking its body, and often with sort of human bones interwoven. And I think the thing I mainly want people to take away from that is this idea of connection and this ability to connect, this sort of fundamental empathy that links people together, but can also link us more closely to sort of the world itself. Just a reminder of our bodies, I think, in a fundamental way, because our bodies are so deeply connected to this world and to each other. Like, we crave physical touch. We crave to feel our feet in the grass and to feel, warm wind in our hair. Like, our physical bodies, I think, are a constant reminder of the need for empathy.
Yeah. Well, and just the fact that, recognizing that everything is and everybody is connected. I mean, we're all part of the same complex system. And if any one of those things is removed, nothing else is sustainable, Exactly.
Yeah. It's a really delicate balance that we're sort of trying to live in. And it's one that has been, pushed pretty far off the edge at this point. And I think that the sense of sort of alarm and chaos that I put in my pieces is also meant to be a reminder of like how fragile these bodies are.
Have you seen your themes or your messaging changing over the years as your, I guess, feelings about the state of the world have evolved?
Yeah, I think I used to do a lot of pieces that were a little bit more directly sort of monstrous. A lot of stuff was sort of like more rent flesh and more blood. I've definitely moved into creating a lot of pieces that I call it my ghost phase. Like, I've been really obsessed with sort of the idea of spirits and ghosts and memories for the last few years. So I view a lot of the work that I'm making now as almost little odes to creatures. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be remembered and what it means to lose something, and thinking a lot about ghosts and the way that we think about ghosts and the way that a memory is sort of like a ghost. So that's what a lot of my recent work is about.
So as far as like your process goes, how do you tend to arrive at an idea for a piece? Like, what's your ideation process? Do you keep a sketchbook? Do you make word lists? Like, what's your brainstorming method?
Sort of all of the above. I keep a little journal by my bedside table because it's always right as you're falling asleep that you get like a million ideas. Yeah. And so that is just like a little word list. I'll just sort of list off. And sometimes in the morning I'll look at it and be like, I have no idea like what this meant. Because I'm like, bluebird, bone, old house. Like, it's just this like odd list of things that I wrote down. But even that is sort of inspiring, even if I don't remember the direct idea. And then I do keep a sketchbook. So I'll have a sketchbook where I'll just doodle little ideas as they come. I have more ideas than I have time to make. So for me, it's more about prioritizing what I'm going to make next rather than like trying to come up with an idea.
It's a good problem to have, having too many ideas.
I know it's like complaining about having too many cookies. But it sometimes haunts me where I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die before I ever make all these things. Like, there's just not enough time in a life to make all of the paintings that I think of. But I do like keeping the lists and the sketchbooks, and I'll go back sometimes. I'll find them from like years ago. I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's that idea I had that I like didn't have time to make then. And sometimes I'll end up, recreating it now, and it'll be a little changed based on, whatever I'm thinking of at the moment. But it is fun to find all those lists. I'm a big list keeper, so
I can relate. I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I read that you like remember all of your dreams, or at least you used to. Is that still a thing that happens? Like, do you have really vivid dreams that you're actually able to remember?
I have extremely vivid dreams. Yeah. Constantly. They're very vivid, very long lasting. When I was a kid, they were all lucid too. It's not the case anymore, but I used to be an avid lucid dreamer as a child. So
it's amazing. I mean, do you have techniques for remembering them, or does it just naturally you wake up and still remember? The problem that I have is I'll have vivid dreams, but I'll forget them like a second after I wake up.
Oh, sure. I often will just naturally remember them. But that's not always the case. Like, if I have a morning that as soon as I get up, I'm like, oh, I have like 500 things to do, like they'll slip away, or I'll just remember like an instant from them. So if I have a dream where I'm like, oh, I really don't want to forget this, I will like write down some like bulletin points of it. Especially if it was like a really visually interesting dream, because I will sometimes draw things from those.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm not like superhuman. Like they will often like fade if I'm not thinking directly about it, but they last for at least a couple hours in the morning. And then it's like, as the day goes on, if I don't like actively focus on it, parts of them will fade away. But yeah, my sister and my brother also are like that. We all have really, really vivid dreams that we remembered, with a fair amount of clarity. And I don't know where that comes from.
That's amazing.
But it happens to all of us. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. So once you have a solid idea for a piece that you want to kind of move forward with, how do you usually work out like the composition? Do you create like preliminary drawings or sketches, stuff like that?
I probably should, but I usually don't. I'll usually just pull out the paper I'm going to work on and start sketching. And then I just erase a lot. I sketch lightly and I'll erase. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but like there's times where your like creative peak is just like rolling, and like anything you draw, like it makes you think of the way people used to believe in muses. It feels as though your body has been overtaken by a muse, and like everything you make just like flows out of you, and it's incredible. Like you've been hit by this wave. And then there's other times where you're literally dragging yourself through it and you realize your page is like more eraser than graphite. And, I've been in that low phase recently, and, it comes and goes. But like lately I have been having to make a lot of preliminary sketches and just sort of work things out a little bit before I start, because I've just been in one of those modes where it's like, oh, right now art is work. And I'm waiting for it'll swing back. It's every like 2 months or so that pendulum sort of swings for me. But I really sort of think on those medieval poets who were waiting for the muse to come to them, because I'm like, oh yes, this is why it feels like that was so real, because when you're in it, it's like, oh, this is almost an out of body experience. Yeah. And when you're out of it, it's like, oh, this is a job and this is hard.
When you don't do much in the way of advanced like preliminary drawings, how do the pieces tend to evolve over time? Like if you just jump right into a piece, how does it change from what you originally kind of conceived to what it ends up becoming in the end?
Oh, sure. The collaboration with the page, if you will. It will often change a lot. The initial graphite sketch is like the most dynamic part of that stage, I think, because I'll start sketching the idea that I had in my mind, whatever that image was, as best as I could hold on to it. But obviously, as soon as you're trying to manifest that onto paper, it shifts, it changes. The sort of reality of drawing physically alters the idea. And it will sometimes change it really rapidly, because as I start sketching, I'll get a new idea. Like I'll see, as I've started to draw like a fox's face, of like, oh, actually it would be really cool if, there was like a series of birds flying past it here. And so it will evolve pretty rapidly, especially during that initial sketching process. Because I'll just get so many different ideas as it's going on, and just seeing it laid out on the page sort of changes. It's like, oh, in my mind, I pictured it differently, but obviously now that I'm collaborating with this piece of paper, the parameters have changed, and I'll sort of alter the ideas there. And it will, sort of the core theme will usually still be there, but often the composition will be different than what I initially thought, just because as I'm drawing, I'll sort of change my ideas and change my poses and see what actually flows best on the page in ways that are not always predictable.
So, coming out of that initial kind of pencil graphite drawing, do you go to ink next and then watercolor, or what's the?
Yeah. So once I have my graphite lines down, I'll ink right on top of them, and then I erase the graphite out from underneath the ballpoint pen or micron pen, whatever I was inking in that day. I call it making my own coloring book, essentially, because then I'll watercolor over that, and it's like I've made myself a little coloring book, essentially. Yeah, I'd say the sketching stage is the most fun for me, because that's the part where ideas are still flowing. There's that sort of like freedom. And then once I'm inking, that's the most tedious stage, but also really satisfying, because that's where I start to really like build in those really lush, dense details. But it also takes a really, really long time. My wrist ends up hurting. I'll be like, why did I decide to put so many feathers in here? That part definitely takes the longest. And then watercoloring is always the part, once I start painting, I'm like, okay, this is it. Like, this is where I could destroy this whole thing right now. there's always that sort of threat because every painting goes through just a massively hideous stage. There's like always one stage where I'm like, well, this is it. I've ruined it. Like, game over, time to start the piece again. And then you just keep pushing, you keep working on it. It's like, oh, actually, no, this is great. But it's such a roller coaster. As soon as I like lift the brush to start painting, I'm like, okay, like, let's just see what happens. It takes a level of fortitude.
For sure. And you also work very like large sizes too. And like I've read that given a preference, you like to make it as life size as possible. I guess, what is it about working, which I think makes what you just said even more stressful, just because you have such a huge piece that you're now, focused on. I guess, what is it that you like about working at such large sizes?
Oh man, I think it ties back to what we're speaking on earlier about wanting it to be real. For me, there's just something really satisfying about drawing a rabbit the size of an actual rabbit, or bigger if possible. Something about the physicality of it. I'm a traditional artist working in traditional mediums, and there's something about having that page in front of you and having drawn whatever this, sort of haunting or mystical or monstrous creature is, and having it look as though it were a viable creature, as if it could sort of get up and run away into the world at any moment. And I find it so satisfying. And obviously, just with the nature of the work I do, I don't often get to work that large. I'm doing a lot of commissions and a lot of album covers and work for galleries where, they often have size limits. But if I can, I like to work life size. I love that sort of feeling of like, okay, here it is. Like, here's the creature. It could stand before me now.
Were there, I guess, unexpected challenges when you first started working that large, as far as just getting the right materials and the space to do it?
When I was in college, oh man, I didn't know that you could like order rolls of actual like watercolor paper. The only paper I'd ever seen big enough to do that on was like the backdrop paper that like my then boyfriend was using for photo shoots. So I would go get those huge rolls of backdrop paper to paint on, but those aren't made for watercolor. Like, you can do dry medium on them pretty well. They're fine. It's like dense enough paper. It's smooth. But like, as soon as you start painting, it's like, oh, this is not made for watercolor. Like, it soaks the pigment in weird. It's also not, it's not like surfaced properly for paint. So like some areas don't absorb pigment at all. Others do, because it's not made for that. It's backdrop paper. Yeah. And that's what I was using like in college, until I finally, I think like my junior year, learned that there was like a paper shop in Manhattan where you could go and like look through huge sheafs of paper, sort of like shopping for rugs. Like, you could go like actually look at them all and talk to people about it. But I definitely made a lot of mistakes early on trying to work that big. I even have old pieces that I made then where I would get like 18 by 24 inch sketchbook pages and I would just tape them together and then like draw the creature on them. So I have like this huge, it's like a 3-foot mouse that I made in college that I still really like. I still have it, but it literally folds in half because it's like, it's just 2 pieces of paper taped together.
Do you have like a dedicated studio space? Because I imagine making that kind of room in a home, it would be difficult. So do you have like a... Yeah, especially here in Oakland where, space is at a premium. I have like a studio space in my kitchen, which is where I'm at now. So I've got like I've got a little desk that can change sort of levels in here. I can angle it up. And I've got all my like supplies sort of against the wall over here in these jars. But, it is also a kitchen. So like the refrigerator goes, there's people in and out cooking. Like my boyfriend will be in here like puttering and I'm just in here like drawing monsters with my cat on my lap. Like, and then I do have like an auxiliary space in my bedroom that's like a really big drafting table where I'll often do like my sketching work because it's a larger space. But I don't have just one room, unfortunately, that's like a studio room. It's sort of scattered around the apartment. And so when you're working on a really large piece, I guess, how do you is there enough space for that?
I usually work on the floor. Yeah, I'll push my couch out of the way and I'll roll the paper out on the floor and start sketching there. And I'll have to like stand up and walk around it. Because, if you're just sitting on one side of a big piece, your proportions end up all wonky. Like the bottom ends up small and the top ends up really big. Just because of the way you're sitting, you can't tell. So I have to like get up and walk all around the piece while I'm working on it. And of course, I'm in my 30s now. So it's, let's just say, not super easy on my back to do that. I need to develop a better system. If you've ever seen like the images of like Lori Lipton working in her studio, she's got these big wall mounted boards where she can, because she also works on paper, but she can like pin her paper up, and then she's got a little sort of like movable shelf to rest her arm on. And I was like, I gotta get a system like that.
Yeah, I've seen that. Like it's vertical. She has it
incredible.
all worked out.
I know. So at some point I'm going to have to adapt a system like that just to spare, my poor aging back. But for now I do still just same as I did in college. I push everything to the side. I've got hardwood floors, and I just put the paper out and do the sketch there. And then I'll I'll roll the paper up when I stop working on it so that my cat doesn't, just completely wreck it, and then unroll it again to work on it.
When you are working on a large piece like that, do you work on multiple pieces, just sort of break things up? Because I imagine it takes a long time to work on that one large piece. Or do you just like focus completely on the one until it's finished?
I usually work on multiple pieces. I have a little bit of like a scattered approach because I will get sort of bored with one piece. So I'll usually work on anywhere from like 2 to 6 pieces at the same time. Especially if I have commissions coming in, it's like, oh, I need to like work on this commission. I'll like rotate through, and as ideas sort of come, like sometimes you'll get sort of stuck on one or just like won't speak to you. Then it's nice. I'll jump to something else and sort of clear my brain and start sketching. And because they're all at different stages, usually it's like, oh, I can just jump back into the graphite sketch for this piece. And then I can, once I feel good about that, I'll like get back into sort of the more daunting, like watercolor work on another. And that helps me. I can kind of like rotate throughout the day based on where my creativity is and where my energy levels are.
Sure. As far as your choice of mediums go, obviously, watercolor is a big part of it, ballpoint pen or micron. It seems like you use ballpoint pen more often than not.
Yeah.
Talking to another artist, Jeremy Hush, who was on my second episode way back when I first started.
Oh, that's awesome. Jeremy's incredible.
And we were talking about his choice of using ballpoint pen, and that all stemmed from just his experience traveling on the road, and it just happened to always be around. So I guess how did you first start using ballpoint pen and make that a key part of your practice?
It was definitely what I just used when I was a teenager. Again, similar to Jeremy, just because that was what was around. And I would always have, pens with me for class when I was, lugging them around. And so I would always do doodling and sketches in ballpoint pen, just as like a middle schooler and a high schooler. And so once I went to art school, that's when I was like, oh, like you can't use ballpoint pen. That's, that's not considered like, fine art, capital A art isn't done with ballpoint pen. But then after I saw that like Walton Ford show and saw a couple other shows, like there were artists working all in ink and ballpoint pen. And so I was like, screw this. Like I'm going back to the ballpoint pen because I just love it. I love the texture of it. And so, yeah, it was definitely something resurrected from my childhood that I got back into. I'm just a little obsessed with it. So,
and was your love of watercolor also like stemmed from your childhood experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also going back to my youth. Almost everything I'm doing now is like essentially brought back from my childhood, which always makes my parents laugh because they're just like, all those little watercolor kits we got you as a kid really paid off. Huh?
That's a great investment. I mean, that's
I know.
Awesome. So
yeah.
You also use acrylic at times, though. So I guess when do you decide, when a piece should have acrylic, and how do you use acrylic in combination with your watercolors?
I'll usually do the watercolor layers first because obviously watercolors need to be built translucently. And so you need to start from like a light base and build up your darks with watercolor. And so I'll do all of that. And then if I want like a really opaque sort of black or like a really opaque green or red, that's when I'll come in with acrylics or like acrylic wash. Because it has such like a deep, solid pigmentation. And that's usually what I want it for. I want it when it's like, oh, I want that velvety black background, which is really hard to get with watercolor because of its nature. And so those like deep, deep black backgrounds on my pieces are usually done with acrylic. Or if I have a piece where I'm like, I want these eyes to have like really dense, like solid red pupils, I'll use like a red acrylic, something that is just a full like light stop essentially. So that I use it as sort of like a touch up essentially.
Okay.
It's rarely like a full piece in it. Although when you see those big pieces of mine that have like the really solid backgrounds, that background is often done in acrylic just to get that opacity, you know. It takes a really long time to get that with watercolors. And I'm using really nice, like pigment dense watercolors, but they still, like, you're not going to get that same like solid color base that you can get, as quickly with acrylics.
For sure, yeah. So we talked a lot about just the themes that you work in when you're doing, your own, kind of personally directed work. But like you said earlier, you also do commissions, pretty regularly. So, like, I guess, how does that work? How do people usually, I guess, engage with you to request a commission? Starting there.
People usually, I ask people to email me. I think a lot of people still are trying to ask me on Instagram or like DM me on Twitter. But of course I don't see it because I don't check those. I'll see comments sometimes and be like, oh, like shoot me an email. And I always feel bad because I'll sometimes get people who will email me and be like, oh, I DM'd you like a couple months ago. And I'm just like, oh boy, like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't check those. Like, it's just too daunting to keep up with all the various, social media messaging. But yeah, so most people email me and I'll go through the stuff that people send me and see if their idea resonates with me and then send them my rates. And if we can agree to a rate, I'll take on the project. And I do anywhere from like 2 to 6 commissions a month, kind of depending on my energy level and what I get coming in.
And when people approach you for a commission, do they usually come with like a fully fleshed out idea, or do they?
Most people do. Yeah. Most people have like a pretty distinct idea, and then I usually have to like talk with them a little bit about it just to see if it's actually something that I can do. Or sometimes it'll be an idea where I'm just like, oh, I'm just not like really interested in that, in which case it's not a project I'll take on. Although I used to, like when I first started out, I would take any commission because it was like, all right, this is paying the bills. It's only kind of recently that I've been like, you know what, like I actually don't have to take on like absolutely everything. So now I'm a little bit more selective because there's some stuff that's really fun to create. And then there's others where I'll read the idea and I'm just like, oh, like this is going to be a drag to have to like, pull myself through. And yeah. So I've been limiting my commissions. I used to take on a ton more. And lately I've just been trying to focus more on doing like limited edition print releases and then just making personal work. Because I spent a lot of years really not making any personal work. Almost everything I was making was commissions just because I went through a rough patch over the last few years in my personal life where I was the main financial the breadwinner in my relationship. And so I had to be the one pulling in a certain amount of money every month. And so I just took on literally every commission that came my way for years, to the point where I got really burned out on it. Like, I think after everything was finally done, I spent 3 months where I pretty much didn't draw at all. Like, I just could not even, bring myself to put pencil to paper. And now luckily I'm on the upswing. So
coming out of that experience, did you establish certain like boundaries as far as things that you will or won't take on, just to guard yourself against that sort of thing?
I definitely had to limit it where it's like, if you have you have to send me your idea first. And if I like the idea, I'll take it. Cause I used to just have people, I'd give them my rates. And if they agreed to my rates, then they could tell me what they wanted. But that was a bad system because I wound up getting a lot of projects. Not that any of them were like awful or like gross or bad, but just projects that weren't very creatively fulfilling. And it just really burned me out. So now I have people send their ideas first. Cause if it's a cool idea, then great. Like, I love to make a monster. I love to do a weird metal band album cover. Like, I love all that stuff. But, I don't take on pet portraits anymore because even though I love critters, I don't, it's just not super fun for me. And it's really emotionally fraught usually for the people commissioning it because it's often for like a pet who has recently passed away, and trying to like match sort of the connection that someone had with their pet and make it into a painting is always going to be challenging. So
for sure. Yeah. And just as somebody with a lot of empathy, I imagine that's difficult,
Yeah. It's a little gutting sometimes. I'm like, oh, I want this to like look exactly like their cat. But you can't, how do you capture a living creature in a meaningful way? And so I don't really take those on anymore. I've been trying to limit it to stuff that sparks a little bit more creativity and people who are a little bit more open-ended. the vast majority of people who contact me have a pretty set idea. But I do still get clients who will just be like, hey, like, I just like your work. And if you could just make me something, they'll give me like a loose theme, like, oh, something with a bird. I'm like, great. Like, I love that. That's fun.
I think that's the best. I mean, I having been in the position of commissioning an artist, like I always take the route of, I'll throw out a couple ideas, but I want you to do something that's exciting to you, because coming out of that, it's going to be a better result. Like, it's going to be more exciting for you to work on, and thus you're going to put more heart into it,
Exactly. But you can always tell the work that like an artist got to really put their stamp on versus something that was like, okay, they just had to like follow the guidelines. Yeah. It just feels different.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something completely unrelated to your art practice, but that I found, pretty interesting having followed you for a bit. You're big into fostering kittens. And I guess you've been doing that for a while now. So like, how did that become a part of your life?
Sort of by accident. So I moved to California about 8 years ago, and 7 years ago, my sister, because I have an identical twin who also lives here in Oakland, she had gotten involved with a local cat rescue called Feral Change, that focuses on doing TNR for feral cats, but also bringing kittens in for foster. And so she was out, trapping cats, with some of the other volunteers, and they caught like a little 2-week-old. Not even caught, because you can't even, catch it in a trap, but they found one. And they did the full protocol, like waiting for the mom cat. Couldn't find it. The kitten was in distress. So they brought it into foster. But at that time, they didn't have anyone who could take it, because neonatal kittens have to be fed every 3 hours around the clock, or every like 1 to 2 hours if they're small enough. And if you work a 9-to-5 job, like that's just, you can't do it. Like, take a kitten and put it on your desk. Like, you'll probably annoy half your coworkers. But so she just asked me, she's like, I had never fostered a kitten. I had never taken care of a neonatal, but she's like, oh, you work from home. Like, do you want to take this kitten? And I was already a night owl. I've always been more of most of my creativity comes at night. So like, I'm always up. She's like, well, you don't sleep and you work from home. So why don't you take this kitten? And I've never really been able to say no to my sister. So it's just like, all right, like, I'll just try. I'll take it in and see what happens. And now, 120 kittens later, 7 years later, that's what I do.
You can't let her know that you can't say no to her.
Like, that's I know. A recipe. It's so dangerous. I can't let her listen to this.
So what does it usually involve? What does the fostering process usually entail?
So because I specialize these days in like neonatals and also critical kittens, because over the years I've learned a lot of medical skills just through neonatals are often require critical care. So I've essentially had the crash course in like medical care for kittens, just from getting these like little tiny sick kittens and having to figure out how to help them, because a lot of vets aren't trained in neonatal care. It just doesn't, they usually see adult pets. And so vets often wouldn't know like what medications they could give kittens that small. And so I just had to figure all of it out. So I now have essentially a small kitten hospital in my closet. I've got subcutaneous fluids. I've got all these medications in case they're, things to deworm them, things to deal with various infections, like all this stuff. I call it my cat closet. You just like open it up. It's just all this like cat gear. But mostly I just, the rescue technically owns them until they get adopted. So if I get like a 2-week-old kitten, I'll have them for, 6 weeks until they're like 8 weeks old, and then they get adopted. And I just, I bottle feed them until they're weaned. And then once they're weaned, they get to like run around my kitchen, which is my studio space, because it closes off entirely. So I'll just be in here painting, and it'll just be little kittens, scampering around the floor. And, they get dewormed, they get defleed, they get microchipped, they get spayed and neutered, and then they get adopted. And then I get the next batch. And that's pretty much all summer long. That's what I do, is I get little litters of, neonatals that either community members or shelters get. And if the shelters are overflowing, which obviously they often are, they'll reach out to the rescue to see if we have fosters for neonatals, and that's me. So I'll end up with little litters of, tiny baby kitties, and bottle feed them around the clock. And, I'll be up like drawing some like, metal album cover with one hand and like holding a little sleeping kitten in my other hand.
How many do you usually take on at once?
In the old days, I used to take on a ton. Again, a lot of my life over the last few years has been learning about setting boundaries in terms of my career, but also in terms of fostering. So I think the most kittens I ever had in here, I had 15 at one point. It was like 4 different litters, and they all had to be kept in separate crates and everything. And it was like living in a petting zoo. I don't do that anymore. Now I try to just have like 1 litter at a time because it's easier on me, but also it's better for them. They get all of my attention, they get more focus, and there's just less risk of, kittens can have all kinds of illnesses. So there's just less risk of crossing, 1 litter that has one thing with another. So
Sure. I guess in the early stages when you're first getting into it, was it hard to like let them go? Like, did you become attached, or is that because you have so many?
Now it's so funny. I call myself Lady Iceheart because I'm just like, all right, goodbye, kittens. Like, but yeah, in the beginning, it was really hard. The very first kitten I ever fostered, that little 2-week-old that my sister brought me, her name was Winnie, and I just got so attached. I remember when she finally got adopted, I like made myself a little slideshow on my computer of all her like pictures, and I was very teary-eyed, but I wound up becoming friends with the woman who adopted her. We're still friends to this day, so I actually still get to see her. And I will say after I think like the 10th kitten, I stopped getting super emotional about it because it was just like, well, I have done my best to take care of these babies, but like now I see they're going to great homes. And if I want to foster more, they have to go. Like the whole point is to say goodbye. The whole point is that they get adopted and go to good homes. Because otherwise I would own like 120 cats. And that would be a nightmare.
Or an adventure.
Sure. 101 Dalmatian style, my kitten plantation somewhere.
So let's talk about what you have coming up. Like, what does the rest of 2021 and the start of 2022 look like for you?
I am currently trying to figure out my show schedule for 2022. So I do have a show coming up with my good friend Brian Surway, who's a really awesome artist who lives out in Appalachia. And I have really been limiting my shows over the past couple years because, again, I used to take on just so many, and it's a lot of work to prep for a show. So I've only been doing a few, but I've got a show coming up, I think next November of 2022 with Brian Surway, and I have to make 8 pieces for that. It's like between 6 to 10 pieces depending on the size. So because it's just a 2-person show. So that's going to be my big project leading up to that. It'll probably end up taking me all of the time leading up to it to do, just because I'm always running behind. So
where's that show going to be so people can keep an eye out for it?
Let me actually check my email real quick and see, because my brain is soup and I can never remember anything. When Brian invited me to it, I almost said no too, just because like it's tough to have to make so much work, but it is far enough in the future where I was like, okay, I think I could do this. Every once in a while, I'll have galleries that I really love reach out to me, but it will be, like a month before the deadline. I'm just like, I just can't do it because I'm usually booked out with commissions at least 3 months in advance. So it's like, it's hard to like have time. All right. It is going to be at Dark Art Emporium.
Very cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and that'll be with Brian Surway. So that'll be really fun. That's the show that I'm thinking about doing a bunch of the sort of disembodied themed pieces for, more stuff relating to sort of like ghosts and bones and stuff like that. So
awesome.
I'm starting to lay out some ideas for pieces right now, which is just a bunch of lists that I have going with words and things on them at this point.
Very cool. Anything else coming up that you like to put on people's radar, like print releases, events, stuff like that?
I've got a print release next month. I'm finally going to release my Rat King prints, which people have been asking me about for a while. So that'll be exciting. I'm just working on the print design for that. And I'll probably end up doing shirts of that design as well. So that's fun. I'm just sort of fiddling around with it right now, trying to make a couple alterations for the print. I work traditionally, but every once in a while I get like really caught up in like combining stuff digitally when I'm like, ooh, like if I make a shirt of this, like, do I want, I could add these extra elements to the background. So right now I'm in that stage where I've gotten myself way too excited, like coming up with different sort of designs for the shirt and print. But I'm going to be doing that for next month. So that'll be my next big print release. And I just did my Vicar Amelia print release this month, which was really fun. That was my first Bloodborne inspired painting.
Awesome.
And I'm hoping to actually do a couple more Bloodborne inspired pieces over the next couple months if I've got time, just because that was really fun. I've been watching a lot of game playthroughs of that It's a little obsessive for me now because the monster design is really cool and I love a good monster design. So I've gotten pretty into that. So people can probably look forward to more of those pieces coming up next year. So
very cool. Do you usually try to have, do you have like a strategy as far as trying to release one print a month or?
I try to space it out. So I also do releases with People's Print Shop, which is a great print shop here in Berkeley. And they also do releases for me once every 3 months. So I'll usually space it out where it's like I'll do a release through them. And then like 2 months later, I'll do my own release. So it's sort of like a month and a half cycle between like when they're putting out prints and then when I'm putting out prints. And I've been trying to up that. I used to only put out a limited edition print myself like twice a year. And I had a Society 6 shop that does like open edition prints. But I like doing my own limited edition releases more now. And I finally have like a good shipping system down, which really was the main thing that was holding me back, was like not having a good shipping system down. Because obviously packing and shipping all the prints is pretty time consuming.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But now that I've got that down, I've been trying to do a lot more of those releases because it's fun. And sometimes if it's a painting that hasn't sold at a gallery yet, my instinct would be like, oh, I'm not going to sell prints of that, especially open edition. But I really like to sell prints of stuff because a lot of people want art but can't necessarily afford an original. So it's fun to do a limited edition release because I'm like, okay, like I'm just going to put out, 40 or 50 of these prints. And that way the original still has its own sort of special status. But now these prints are out there. And for people who want to collect art but, can't spend that much, like this is a good way to collect art that also is special because limited edition prints are all signed and numbered. And
right.
So that whatever you have is like, something that's a fraction of a limited whole.
Yeah, for sure. So what's the best way for people to like stay up to date with what you have going on?
My Instagram and my Twitter, I post to daily. At least I try to. I'm pretty good about it. Social media is a whole other sort of job front, but those are where I post the most about prints that are coming up, pins, shows. Pretty much everything is on my Instagram and my Twitter. I am going to try and make a TikTok, but that's a whole new venture.
Whole new world, yeah. It's like a whole series of inside jokes. I enjoy it.
It's really fun. It's really easy to like dive into different like wormholes.
There's berries and cream TikTok.
Yeah. It's so good. It's so satisfying. So I am going to try and do that so that I can like film more time lapses of my work because that's always fun. But it's also something I often forget to do. Like I'll start painting a piece and I'm like, oh crap, like I was going to set up a time lapse for this. So I'm going to try and do that. But for now, the best way to sort of follow my day-to-day updates on upcoming prints and whatnot is definitely my Instagram and Twitter, which are both the same handle. They're just Caitlin_Hackett. So everything is on there, including the occasional cute kitten picture.
Awesome. Very cool. So last question, and this is something that I like to ask everybody. Who is one artist that you'd like to see me have on the show?
Oh, man. I don't know if you've talked to Allison Sommers.
I have. Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
she was, sorry, but she's,
there you go. She's incredible, I'm sure, as you know.
Yeah, she's awesome.
It's like, God, talking to her is incredible. She just has a brain that works differently. She's incredible.
I really enjoyed talking to her. Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Yeah, I miss her a lot. We used to do art salons together in New York when I lived there. And I just miss, getting together and like talking art and bitching about, the various aspects of being artists. And let's see, who haven't you had on? I should have done more research on this.
Oh, no.
I don't know if you've talked to Christina Morozic, but
I have. I've had. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you've done everyone.
I've had everybody that you.
Yeah, those are my girls. That's Chris is also one of my like sort of besties in the art world. We did an artist residency program years ago together.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, out in Michigan, and she's one of those people that if I'm like having a hard time, if I'm like, oh, I think I'm just like done with this whole art thing, I can like contact her, and she's just so soothing and poetic, and she's got such like a calming energy. I'm just like, great, here's who I'm going to.
Oh, poetic is a great way to put it. I'm amazed. I mean, I love her poetry in general, what she's shared of it, but just the way that she thinks, it's very just super creative.
Oh, yeah. I used to compare her to a fae being. She's just sort of otherworldly.
So do you want to try one more, or do you want to just leave it at that?
Well, what about my buddy Brian Surway, who I'm doing the show with next year?
I have not had him on, so yeah there we go.
He's great. He is really fun. He does cryptids and monsters. He focuses a lot on endangered species from like the Appalachian region, and also on like really cool sort of cryptids and monsters, and lots of sort of ephemeral creatures sort of fading into starry skies and strange dark forests and things like that. So
awesome.
And if you're into cryptids, he knows a lot about cryptids, which is very fun.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, great choice. I'll check it out, and definitely keep an eye out for the show next November with you guys at Dark Arts Emporium. But thank you so much for doing the show. This was really a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was really fun. It's good to get my old rusty art wheels back in motion. Fun to talk about everything.
So that's it for this episode of Art Affairs. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Caitlin. It was so nice to hear about how Caitlin's parents, really fostered her and her siblings' creative side and, helped them to pursue their dreams in that way. I feel like it's easy to take that sort of thing for granted, but it's such an important thing when it happens. But then also to have that super inspirational museum exhibition, which, only was really made possible by being in that particular drawing class at Pratt. It's so fascinating to me how these, kind of seemingly small and random coincidences so drastically change the course of our lives each and every day. Our lives truly are these beautiful orchestrations of, completely random circumstances, all interwoven together with the people around us, ultimately spitting out this incredibly complex and nuanced person. I'm also super interested in what she had to say about humanity's relationship with animals and how we as a people put everything in terms of what we will consume and what we won't consume. And it's so true. And I feel like that's such a savage mindset. I mean, we like to think our species has become, so sophisticated that we've transcended these animalistic tendencies. But then at the end of the day, we feed right directly into them. That's really fascinating. Definitely keep an eye out for Caitlin and Brian's 2-person show next November at Dark Art Emporium. It sounds like it's going to be an excellent show. Follow Caitlin and the gallery's Instagram to stay up to date with the latest. I've included both in the show notes. So thanks again to Caitlin for joining me today, and thank you for checking out the show. I'm truly grateful for your support. And just a reminder, one big way you could help out if you're really enjoying the show would be to check out the show's Patreon. You can find all the details on patreon.com/artaffairs. And as always, you can contact me through my website at artaffairs.podcast.com or on Instagram at artaffairs.podcast. So until next time, be good to yourself and be good to each other.